My name is Pat Sullivan, and my father's name was Cornelius Matthew Murphy, and he was born in 1887.
I'm Kathleen Murphy Riley, the third child of Cornelius and Elsie.
His father, who was also Cornelius Matthew, was born in Ireland and was brought over as an orphan to Chicago in about before 1850, because it was during the time of the famine, and he was an orphan and was brought over by a priest. And he was raised in Chicago, the grandfather and the father. Dad had 5 brothers and sisters. There were 6 in the family. He evidently moved to Green Bay in 1911, he went into, as a teenager, he learned all about typewriters. He learned to take them apart and put them together fast. They had contests. When he graduated from 8th grade, he was awarded a trip to Washington, D.C. And in that days, that was kind of a big thing. It would be in the 1890s. But he couldn't take it because he had a paper corner. And if you were a newsboy in Chicago, you had to hang on to your paper corner or you would lose it. So he always afterwards said, "And do you know what the boy that took the prize," since my dad couldn't do it, "you know what he became? He became a mailman." And my father thought that didn't take much at all to be a mailman. And so he was sent to Green Bay as the representative of the Underwood Typewriter Company. And I think that was about, it had to be about 3 or 4, because I don't have any memory of Green Bay. We always were very close to our relatives there, always spent Christmases and vacations and everything up in Green Bay. Mother was very close to her family, and we didn't see that much of Dad's family because they were spread all over. And so he was in Green Bay, and that's where he met my mother. And she was raised in Green Bay, born and raised there. Her maiden name was Butler, Elsie Butler. But she was more German than Irish. And so then she met my father. And she was probably about 21 or something at that time. She had been working as a legal secretary, I know that.
She was a legal secretary and worked in a law firm. And my father came in to sell a typewriter. And all she remembered was his blue eyes. And he just, loved her. She was a contralto. That's why my voice is so low. She, very trained singer, did a lot of light operas and things in town. And also was a very good piano player. So I think a lot of their courting was probably following her. But then along with it, you see, they started having children, and she loved, I think, his hobby too, which was the Packers.
And they were married in, I guess, 1915. So he was there for about 4 years before they were married. And then John was born in 1916, and I was born in 1919. Kathleen was born in 1921. Then we had a gap. So it was like there were the 3 for a long time. And then Joanne was born in 1927, and Bud was born in 1929.
I just had a wonderful childhood. And we lived next door to this golf course. And of course, in the winter, we had toboggans, and I remember my dad out there with us going. It was called Blue Mound Country Club because it had all these little hills all over it. And so in the winter, it was just paradise. And I remember my dad out there just pushing us down the hills. And the winters in Wauwatosa were cold. Wisconsin is a very cold state. And I do remember lots of snow. And we lived at the end of a street because the golf cart started there. And they used to have to plow, just a horse and a plow would go by to open up the streets, because we were right at the right at the end. And so that's what was really fun, because in the winter, of course, the golf course was closed, and it was our just playground of doing that. And there was also a water hole, so we used to ice skate on it. So it was I'm sure hard for people that had to drive and do stuff in it, but it was just ideal for a child, because we had our wonderful summers, because summers were hot. And we used to go down to the lake shore a lot. We'd leave, my mother would pack up dinner, and we'd pick up meet my dad, because they both drove, and have picnics after he finished working up in the park over Lake Michigan. And they were just kind of people that liked to do things. And like I say, we spent the summer, it was called Lake Tishigan. I think it was only one summer we stayed there the whole summer. And he would commute from work in Milwaukee out to, because their lakes are everywhere, and they're like 15, 20 miles out of town. Of course, it was a big deal in those days, but he would commute and come out at night. And of course, in the winter, in the summer, there's just tremendous lightning and thunderstorms, and remember those looking out over the lake. And they always had a lot of people come and visit, because they did like to have fun. Lots of music and lots of singing. And he started a big career down in where we lived, near Milwaukee in Wauwatosa. And so I kind of remember my growing up with him and my mom, and lots of music and lots of parties and lots of friends. But they always, kept that alive, because that was a big, big part of his life as a spectator. And I remember when the teams got better, or there was a big rivalry between Green Bay and the Chicago Bears, and they would go down to Chicago and see those games. I mean, that when he was long past his, association with the teams.
He always, talked about it, and we would listen to when we were young, we listened to the Packers when they were on the radio, because they were good. They were winning the championships and all this, everybody. So we always were kind of aware. Once they got maybe like in the 26, 27, 28, about that, when I was 9, 10, or so on. But we'd never heard about him before, because they were so not important to him, I don't think, after he left.
Yes.
But then it was. Then he went, I do remember the time he went to a reunion, and but he went by himself, and he told us afterwards that he was on the field and was introduced by all the, they introduced everybody. And that was I think in the book, it tells, in that book that I have, it was about 1928. So that was kind of a thrill for him. But he always had his gold watch that had, the inscription on the back of it was to Coach Murphy from the team, so on, in loving some kind of, I don't remember what it said because it was stolen, but he always had that gold watch was saying to that. But he never said anything afterwards. It wasn't like he kept saying, oh my God, I lost my identity or anything. He never, that was gone, and that was that. We figure it might have been a caddy, because we lived next door to the golf club. I don't know, but the burglar came in through the garage roof and through the breakfast room into the kitchen, and I can remember my mother telling the police, there's his footsteps, because he was barefoot, and his footsteps were on the kitchen floor. But that's all he stole, is my father's cufflinks. He had diamond cufflinks that my mother had taken diamonds out of something she had and had them put in to cufflinks for him one time. So he had the diamond cufflinks and his stick pin and his watch. Because every night when he came home, he would sit in the front room, read the paper, take this stuff off and relax and read the paper there.
Pat talks about how he'd come home from work and take off his stiff collar and put all his diamond stick pin and stuff. And I can remember as a child sitting on his lap and combing his hair. You know, he was just a wonderful family man. And I think which is why he was so respected when he did the organizing in those years. Because, you know, he was a stranger, big city boy from Chicago, comes up there, and, you know, he had been quite an organizer in his youth, too, and, of course, played a lot of sports. So I think he just might have been a little bit bored, so he thought, let's get something going here.
Well, Uncle Bud always lived in Chicago, and he was the youngest of the family, and he was very, very close to Neil. And he did, after my dad died, he did tell me that he was an excellent baseball player in Chicago in his youth as a semi-pro. So when he was also managing fighters and doing all the things he was doing in Chicago, he was also playing baseball.
In later years, he took up golf. We grew up next to a golf course, and he was funny because he played the part, the outfits, the tat, plush fours. And then also I do remember for some reason or other he got into horseback riding. And I remember going to the ring and he was all out in his jodhpurs and stuff. He was a kind of a showboat guy in a way. But that was all part of his charm. Now my mother wasn't athletic. I do remember she took up golf one time. She had the whole outfit too. They were so cute. They were, you know, those were the 20s. Those were fun, 20s and 30s, you know, before things really got for the Depression. So I think they had a pretty good time. I remember him teaching me to do the Charleston one time. Isn't that funny? You remember things now, it's coming back. But we just had a lot of fun.
What I remember as much as anything is on Sundays, we always went out to dinner downtown Milwaukee. It was sort of when there were just the three children. And my dad was always very proud. He'd introduce us to wherever of these different restaurants and things, his family. And our recreation was more going to Green Bay. We went to Green Bay a lot, and although we went, later on we rented a cottage in a lake near Milwaukee called Tishkin, and we had a cottage there. We spent all summers there, but he would drive in back and forth to work. We'd spend the summers at the cottage.
My memories are of my mother and father being very fun-loving and very adventurous. We took many, many trips around and went to New York, and we'd get in these funny little old cars. We'd pile us in there and drive up around the lakes. And there's a lot of Indians in reservations in those early days of Wisconsin. And he was funny. He'd be driving along. If it was a windy road one time, he said, "I'm sure this road was laid out by a drunken Indian." I just never forgot it. I don't know why. It was just kind of a funny thing to say. Thinking of how cute he was with Tim, my oldest son. He had a rocking chair, remember, a wicker rocking chair, and he used to hold him and rock back and forth and sing a song, "A-tenting we go." That's funny, I'd remember that. "A-tenting we go." That's funny. He was a good sport. We sang in the car, and he was just a really nice man. And my mother was lonesome for her family in Green Bay, so we would go back up there a lot. And of course, he followed the games, was always a great spectator of sports all his life. Too bad he didn't live long enough for television. He really would have been glued to it because he followed everything, as I recall.
We lived in Milwaukee. We never lived in Milwaukee. We lived in Wauwatosa, which is a little town alongside of Milwaukee. And not exactly a suburb, it was a real town. And we lived there until 1937 when Dad was made, he switched to Royal typewriters, and was appointed manager of the Royal Typewriter Company in Oakland. And so then, from then on, we lived in Oakland until he died in '45. He died of a brain tumor, really, and he used to get these terrible headaches, just all of a sudden, you know. I mean, he was healthy until then, it seemed to me, and then he would get these headaches, and the doctors couldn't figure out, and they thought it was something. First, they always thought he had something wrong with his ear, which he did, which turned out. Then they were going to operate. I remember very well. This was during the war, and all of a sudden he felt better. And I can remember being in some office building where he went to the doctor, and they were talking about operating. And he said, "Well, no, I don't get those headaches anymore." Well, what must have happened? Something happened, and all of a sudden, whatever happened burst, and he died in 24 hours. No, he died in the hospital. So that was that.
I'm sure he would have so enjoyed the Packers' success, and it's sad that he passed away at such a young age, because sports were a big part of his life, and those early Green Bay days were fun for him. They took me to the games as an infant, so it must have been 1921 in the fall, because my mother was very supportive, and of course it was a big deal. And in fact, I heard one story where it snowed and they had to take me to the local rectory at the priest's house, and they forgot me. That was kind of a funny story. But at any rate, you know, I heard all the years about the wonderful Packer years, and we would go back to Green Bay a lot, and of course it was fun. But as I say, I was an infant, and then we moved to Wisconsin. But my dad was just the warmest, wonderful father, very formal, and very formal like men were in those days.
Well, and that's the way all the men in those days dressed, unless you were, you know, some kind of an ordinary workman. You dressed in a suit with a hat, with usually a straw hat in the summertime, and felt hats or whatever. There's a picture of him with the derby when he was very young, but he didn't wear derbies when I knew him. He used whatever felt hats they used in those days. But if you ever see pictures of the men in the Depression, these guys in breadline standing, they all have suits and hats. Yes. Even then.
Fortunately, he always had a job, and good job, but I'm sure money was short, and I was very aware of it. But there were people would come, you know, to the door, because there were such poverty around that I think the people camped in the golf course, some parts of the golf course, people that were out of a home, and they would come to our back door and beg for food. My mother would give them, boy. They just and he took care of a lot of people too. So actually, as I say, when I read books about the Depression, they didn't have that big of an impact on me personally, fortunately. But I certainly was aware that there was it around in the area.
He was very business oriented, but he was also his work didn't. He wasn't like my husband, always entertaining, because it was a 9-to-5 job. His was, because he was selling typewriters to business people and to high school typing teachers and so on. So he was always home. 5 o'clock, he was home. He was always very stable as a father, but he was not a helper around the house. He was not a handyman. He didn't know how to do anything. And my mother was pretty good. She even gardened and stuff like that. She did everything that was done, and because she was a big, strong woman. And he let her do it because he just wasn't interested. And if there was any extra work to be done around the house, and there often was, she would call this handyman that we'd have to go get, and Mr. Rogers to come, tell him to hurry up and come, something, not the large things, which he always did, but like changing the storm windows and the screens and all those kind of things, but things that would happen. It was like, go down and get Mr. Rogers. He didn't have a phone, and we'd have to go get him to take care of things. But then that's why I was so, in my mind, I couldn't remember how in the world Dad ever shoveled the snow, because the garage was a kind of a little deep decline under the house, went toward the basement, level with the basement. And the snow must have come in there, and he got his cars out every day, and he had to do it, but he never said, I never heard that he did it. So he was just, he did what he had to do, but outside of that, he was working and doing what he was interested in doing, which wasn't working around the house. The one time I do remember when he lost his temper is we had a brand new Buick, 26 Buick, a big car. And he always put his cars away, but this night he left it out in front. And it happened to be Halloween. And we evidently had company or something, because all of a sudden he went out and he just was wild. The kids in the neighborhood had piled a lot of debris and like sawhorses and things on top of the car. And he was mad, which of course, in those days, maybe he thought it would hurt the car because they didn't have metal roofs. They were kind of a composition thing, but the car was perfectly fine. So that was the only time, because he was yelling out for the whole neighborhood to hear him yell about his car. But then what happened a little bit after that was that car was stolen. I guess Dad had it parked downtown. And so that's when we got two cars, because he had to have another car, so he bought one of these Model A Fords. They were nice cars too, really. And then the car was recovered in northern Wisconsin in a ditch. It was perfectly good. Some kids had taken it and probably driven it until it ran out of gas or something. So then we had two cars. From then on, my mother had a car and my father had a car, and they were both happy with that.
Pat and I were very close. We were only 2 years apart. We all shared the same bed and did the same things. And then we went to different schools. My memory of schools, we went to St. Bernard's grade school, which last time I was in Wisconsin, we took a drive down, saw our pictures in the back there. I thought it was so far as a kid, but it really wasn't too far. And we walked it in the snow. And then I went to a high school across town. It was called Mercy High School, a Catholic high school. And I used to ride with my dad down to Wisconsin Avenue and then pick up a deal. But I only went there the 1 year, because then we moved to California the following year when I was my sophomore year, and I went to school in Piedmont. But it was, lots of football games at the local high school. And where Pat went to Wauwatosa High School. Never could figure out why we went to different schools, but I think they treated us all very much as individuals. That was, I think, a very good plus for them. We were very close, our kids, we all were, but we were all very different. So I do remember riding down there, and I'd get out of the car, and then I'd have to take a streetcar all the way across the viaduct and off someplace. And at any rate, that was only 1 year, and then we moved to California. So it was a very difficult adjustment for my sister Pat, I think. My brother John was in the seminary. He was going to be a priest. But she was further along in high school and was a kind of a big wheel, good in the glee club and in school politics, as I recall.
my mother, it didn't take her very long before she had a whole, she was a singer, and so she joined the church choir and then another choral group later. She had a very good voice. She had sung opera local opera in Green Bay. So she had that, and then she played bridge. She was a good bridge player. So she didn't have any trouble getting acquainted. She had a lot of friends. And my dad did too. He was in the Rotary Club, so that was kind of a fun thing. And I think they enjoyed being in California. It took us a year to get used to it because it was so cold for us. We thought it was just freezing. Because there's something about the dampness here. You know the story, hates California, it's cold and it's damp. That's the way we were. So it took us a little while to get used to the weather in Northern California. My brother John, who spent a lot more time in Milwaukee after we had left because he was studying to be a priest, and he is the one that heard that he was such a good salesman, they wanted to have him out of there, and they didn't care whether he made a success of Oakland or not. But he actually did, because the war came along and all the typewriters in the world were bought, and he had his office had a cut on every typewriter that was sold through his office. Yes. To the Oakland Army base or to Sacramento or whatever.
I think she feels just like I do. We're very lucky. My father was a wonderful family man and a very loving family man, and he and my mother were very, very supportive of each other.